My name is Hanif. This is my friend and collaborator Pro. And today we are going to share our visualization called the Singapore News Story.
So when we thought about telling stories in Singapore, the thing we thought of immediately was who's really telling stories on a daily basis? Who has storytelling as their passion, as their profession, and they're doing it? And let's look to them. And so the thing we thought of was the people, the men and women who beat the streets, investigate stories, and every day. And those are the people of the news. And so we went to the National Library Board, which keeps an archive of the Straits Times, for example. Which is a newspaper that's been telling the news, the stories of Singapore since 1845. We crawled the headlines for the last 50 years, since 1955. And we used a set of natural language processing, different analytic methods to tokenize, to produce the words that show up in the news so that we could look at the stories. And then we decided we would do it in a way. Instead of summarizing all the stories that get wrapped up into that, we would do it in a way that allowed anyone to access it and to reproduce it and to do it themselves and to find the stories that matter to them. And here's the stories that matter to us.
So when you think about Singapore and the stories that have shaped this country, what are you thinking of? You might be thinking about our politics, our economy. There are many different ways in which we could play at this. So one of the first things that we wanted you to see was what are the top words that were used in the headlines of the past 50 years? Because that immediately tells you a story. So if you just captured the top 10 words that were used in the headlines of the past 50 years, here's what you'll see. And immediately your eyes are drawn to some pretty dramatic changes. So here we have Tengku. If you remember history, this is Tengku Abdul Rahman, the first Prime Minister of Malaysia. So he was our Prime Minister as well when we were part of Malaysia, but notice how he's so prominent even before and after merger, right? And then you get words like die, it's just a verb, but death, accidents, killings. So a sense of urgency and violence. But notice how the words actually decrease over time. So interesting stories like that. But what's even more interesting is that if you change the parameters of how you look at the top words, you get other things appearing. So if we squint a little harder and actually look at the top 15 words, for example, you get this huge spike in 1980. And what does it say? It says Chinese. Now, what could possibly be happening at the time? So this is where the value of what we've put together comes in, because you're able to just switch, and then you can look at the actual headlines that are associated to the word. So here's that peak there, and if you just hover over it, here's what you see. So remember, this is on the front pages of the Straits Times. So does anyone remember what language policy was being implemented back then? It was the Speak Mandarin campaign, Jiang Huai. So just think about that. The government actually went to the extent of promoting the use of the Mandarin language in our English language daily newspapers. So it's, little anecdotes like that, which you'll miss if you just were looking at the papers themselves. But an analysis like this would enable. And the other thing that we tried to do as well with this visualization tool was a context enabler. So you can see the kinds of associations that are tagged to a certain word.
And so on that previous graph, there's over 4,000 words that were used total, right? And you can look for any of them and see how they change over time. But we can also, and this is a sort of, we see this as an ongoing project, all the code's there. What you can do is you can see the way the words are used together. And you begin to see, what words are showing up with other words. Oh, well, yeah. So that's basically it. But the site is live. You can see it at singaporenewsgithub.io. The data is all behind it, and it's there for you to explore and tell your own story, because it's also about telling your Singapore story.
So Paul and Hanif,
Yes.
You went through the data and you did some analysis. Do you see a pattern that interests you, some story about Singapore?
So precisely, this was one of the most interesting things that I came across. So when we were doing the parsing, there are a lot of junk words that we had to remove, like prepositions of, I, things like that. And when I was looking at the headlines, we almost wanted to remove Chinese.
Is there a trend? It seems to be graph going down.
Oh, I mean, you can even form a hypothesis about that. Like, well, to me, that seems to suggest that back then, in the 50s and 60s, things were more urgent. There were a lot more things to talk about in the headlines. Whereas as we've progressed, things kind of got more stable, and you see less words over time. Perhaps that's what's going on.
Another one that I found interesting was that in the early days, the first 2 decades, there's lots of notions of civil turbulence, strike, tin, all the mining things that were going on, lots of violent terms that connote those. And you see over time they've dropped off almost completely. I think that's a really interesting story about civic development and how Singapore has grown as a nation, a diverse nation.
And what technology did you use to rendition this visual?
So we use kind of a suite of technologies. To crawl, we used Python and R, which was able to pull those in. And then we also used that for a lot of the natural language processing methods that we did to tokenize, to engram, things like that. The thing is, when you start to look at, for instance, words like a co-occurrence matrix, it gets really big. So what we did was we also used the Django backend to serve all the data so that you can get it rather than, because it's just too much. 4,000 words, they go together in over 1 million ways. And then to render it, we used HTML5, JavaScript, and the D3 library to put together all the pieces.